Hello everyone, and welcome to this video on Web Data Connector debugging. This video is going to go through some tips, tricks, and best practices for debugging your Web Data Connectors. My name's Sam. I'm a developer here at Tableau. I've been working on the Web Data Connector for about a year now, so I've learned a lot in my course of creating and debugging various Web Data Connectors. This video is going to be a little bit more on the advanced side and more geared towards people who have solid understanding of how the Web Data Connector works. If you are looking for more of an intro video, please see some of the other videos in this series, which will be more useful to you. So let's just get started now. So the first thing I want to talk about is kind of the process to go through when trying to debug a Web Data Connector. These can often be quite complex pieces of code connecting to various web services with a lot of interesting kind of in-between elements. So this is kind of the process I like to go through when debugging through issues, and hopefully this will work as well for you. So the first thing I'd like to do is to make sure I understand the API I'm trying to talk to. So there's a lot of web services out there. A lot of them are very well documented, but they can be tricky and subtle to get exactly the right inputs and outputs you're looking for. So the first thing I like to do is make sure I understand the endpoint I'm talking to. And there's a lot of web tools that can make this a very easy process and to isolate that part of your code. The next thing I like to do is to use the simulator. The simulator gives you kind of the best of modern browsers debugging, which a lot of browsers have really great debugging tools. And it's a little faster and more iterative process than trying to debug these things within Tableau. But obviously, the next step is if the issue you're having doesn't seem to reproduce in the simulator, or if there's some subtle differences in behavior, the next thing that you can do is take a look at Tableau's log files and output a lot of logging statements to help track down where your issues are occurring. And finally, if that's not working for you, what I recommend is searching or asking on the developers.tableau.com website. And there's a community forum there with a lot of people with a lot of experience who are happy to help out with your questions. So let's dig into a little more details of each of these. So the first thing I mentioned was using web tools to verify your requests. I'd say the key to understanding this is know the URLs that you need to hit and the necessary HTTP methods, the GET, POST, whatever this API endpoint requires. Know what access tokens, parameters, other information that these API endpoints are expecting to be sent. And then finally, know what format you're expecting to get data back in. And so the reason I recommend using dedicated web tools for this is it helps isolate your code or the networking code from your Web Data Connector code. It just helps isolate things out a little bit and can make it much simpler to debug and make sure you have this part of your code really solid. A couple of tools that I recommend using that I use the most are Postman and Fiddler are both really good. And a lot of APIs actually have their own sandboxes or endpoints or Explorer tools you can use. A couple examples are Google has a great API Explorer and Facebook has a great Graph API Explorer that lets you quickly kind of discover and figure out what your request should look like. Those can be super useful. So after you've figured out the endpoints that you're looking for and what your API request should look like, it's time to start making sure your connector works in the simulator. So the simulator is shipped with the Web Data Connector SDK, and it's definitely the quickest way to debug your issues. So you get to leverage the modern browser's debugging abilities, find things like syntax errors, find things like CORS issues, all sorts of different programming errors show up really, really quickly. So I recommend loading up the simulator with the debugging tools enabled and showing, and make sure you pay attention to the messages shown in the console. And so just as a quick example of a kind of contrived example of a way the simulator can help you out, I'll do a little code here. So I'll load up the simulator with our stock quote connector example that we've have a previous tutorial going through. And this version of it is going to have a subtle error in it. So the first thing I'll do is load up our developer tools. And so we'll get these loaded up. You can see we have nothing showing quite yet. So then we'll load up our simulator and we'll have the URL we want to where our Web Data Connector is. So we'll open that up. And so here's our familiar stock quote connector. And now I will type in Tableau stock quote and ask to go get the data. So that, you see we got no more data, shutdown callback got called, so we've completed our Web Data Connector. And so let's see what data we got back. Uh-oh, it looks like we're missing all of the closing prices. So this seems like there's an error somewhere in our code that's actually fetching the stock quotes. So let's see if we can use the debugger and see where this issue might be. So we're in our stock quote example here. It looks like we are getting data back, so I'm going to guess that there's some issue in our logic to try to parse out the results. And so let's reload the page with the breakpoint set here, and let's see what we get. We'll scroll back up. This screen's a little small. Enter our quote again, and going off to the web service. Okay, now we hit a breakpoint here. Let's see what we have. So we have our actual data is this array of quotes. This array of quotes has 252 items in it, and let's see what each item looks like. So it looks like the property we're trying to get is probably this close price, which looks like it's coming back just fine. So let's see when we actually try to assign it and send it back to Tableau what it looks like. That appears to happen here in this entry. So let's continue our execution. Now we're on this first item, and we can see our entry is missing its close price, but we're trying to call it right here. So this is a really subtle error. There's actually a capitalization error in our trying to access the property. Close is lowercase, and it should be capitalized. So now that we know what the error is, let's go back over to our code editor, and let's update this close to be a capital C so that we actually get the right value back. So after we make that change, we'll go back to the simulator, reload the page again, and we'll enter in our stock quote. And we see now we actually have the close prices. So this is just a quick example of the way that the simulator can help making kind of subtle, small programming errors really, really quick to find and very easy to debug. One thing to note about the simulator is there are a few key differences between how it behaves and how Tableau will behave. One of the biggest ones is the JavaScript engine that the simulator will use versus what Tableau will use. So the simulator will use the web browser you're loading the simulator in, its JavaScript engine. So for something like Chrome, like I was just using, that'll use the Chromium engine. Whereas the Tableau web browser that we use within the product is based on WebKit. So there can be some small JavaScript differences and rendering differences that are available that you see in most web development cases, but it's just something to keep in mind. Another key difference is that the simulator doesn't reload the page between the interactive and the data gathering phases, which Tableau does. And then the last thing is the web data connector on the simulator is hosted inside of an iframe in the simulator, which sometimes causes some interesting issues with authentication. And I have some more content on that later on. So if everything's working in the simulator and you're ready to try things out in Tableau, that's great. But sometimes you'll see some of these subtle differences or some small problems, and those can be really difficult to debug in Tableau. And so my advice for the best way to debug this is to actually use console.log or tableau.log and log out verbose logging information to get yourself an idea of where things might be going wrong. And then after these things get logged out, you'll need to look into Tableau's logging files to see the results. So there's multiple different Tableau log files. There's one called log.txt, and that one will contain the information from the interactive phase of the web data connector. So when you actually see the web browser control. There's another file called tabprotoserve.txt, and that one will be the logs from the data gathering phase, which is often the more interesting one. And so I added a couple simple Windows and Mac commands here that'll let you just pull out the interesting parts of the logs related to web data connector. So if you just want to see things that were written out by your web data connector via console.log, you can use this command line option in your logs folder. Or if you want to see anything related to web data connector, you can look here, or you can look at the complete logs. So I'll just show a really quick example of how this can be useful. So here, using our stock quote example, I made a few changes to it to add a lot of logging throughout. So I'm logging the URLs we're building, I'm logging the dates we're trying to get, the digits we're trying to get, when we get our data back, start dates, all that stuff. So we can really trace where things could be going wrong. Now when I load this up in Tableau, examples, our excessive logging example, and then I do the same quote. So while this is running, I will show you, here I am in my Tableau repository in the command prompt, and we'll use this command to pull out just the things that I wrote out via console.log. And I'll just do it out to a file quick to make it easier to read. Okay, and so now we can open it in Notepad. And here it is. So these are all the lines of logging from our web data connector. And so Tableau logs each line as a JSON object, actually. And so we see here's the web data connector tag, which lets us know from there, and here's the actual log message. So this is from our web page, and this is the line number it occurred on. And here's all of those login messages I put out. So when I was doing make two digits, get date, here's our URL we called, got our data back, and then the number of quotes we have. So this is a really quick and easy way to just output as much as possible and see where the error might be happening, and then you can try to narrow things down and see what's going on. So that's one of my favorite tools to use, is actually Tableau's logs. Finally, I just have a short explanation of one of the ways you can debug some of the authentication issues. So it's kind of difficult to use the simulator with web APIs that require authentication, particularly OAuth, because most OAuth flows will block you from using a control that's embedded in an iframe, which is what the simulator does. So as an example of what might happen here, if I load up a web data connector that requires authentication, in this case it's a Square connector that I wrote, connect to the Square point of sale systems. I'll open my developer tools and we'll load up the Square connector. You see it says I'm not signed in, it wants me to sign in to authorize the application. And now when I actually try to sign in to do that, I get a message saying that Square refused to display this in an iframe because that's one of the options they configured to prevent issues. You might think, oh, I'm stuck. I can't debug my web data connector in the simulator. I'll have to use Tableau. There is a workaround for this. What you can actually do is if you copy the link that you were going to redirect to, open up a new tab, paste that in, and this is actually OAuth link, and navigate to the website where you would sign in a different tab. So once you've signed in, it'll actually bring you back to your redirect page. And then if we go back to the simulator and I reload this page, it actually tells me I am signed in because Square added a cookie for me to be able to find and redirect to in this same browser session. So now I can get my Square data. You see it all came back in. So that's just a quick tip for trying to debug a data source that uses OAuth while using the simulator. So a quick wrap up, my kind of flow of how to debug these things is to first understand the API you're using. Next, make sure it works in the simulator. And then try it in Tableau. If it doesn't work in Tableau, check Tableau's logs and make sure you're writing out lots of logging statements to help you. And finally, ask for help. There's a great community around the Web Data Connector, and that website is developers.tableau.com. I hope this was useful. Thanks a lot for listening.